So yeah, dear all present in this Zoom meeting and who will be watching this recording later. So greetings. This is Somava Basu from India, President and founder of the Council for Global Cooperation, CGC. And I would like to warmly welcome you all to our today's session. Our today's session, we are again back with another book discussion. Today's discussion, we focus on a new book by Professor Lauren Benton. They called it Peace, Worlds of Imperial Violence. They called it Peace was published this February by Princeton University Press. Lauren Benton in this book presents an authoritative history of European empires and how their rule of violence shaped the contours of its empires and redefined the very nature of war and peace throughout the 15th to the 20th centuries, and reordering today's world order. And before we start with our today's event and hear the author and discussants lead the discussion, for our viewers, I would like to warmly welcome our author and introduce her, and who is our today's feature speaker, Professor Lauren Benton. Professor Lauren Benton is a comparative and world historian specializing in the fields of global legal history and comparative imperial history. She has contributed significantly in the fields of international law, sovereignty, imperial colonial violence, and wars and global order. Some of her award-winning books include Law and Colonial Cultures, Legal Regimes in World History, 1400 to 1900, A Search for Sovereignty, Law and Geography in European Empires, 1400 to 1900, Rage for Order, the British Empire and the Origins of International Law, 1800 to 1850, which she co-authored with Lisa Ford. Professor Benton is currently Barton M. Biggs Professor of History and Law at Yale University. She received the 2019 Toynbee Prize for significant contributions to global history and served as the president of the American Society for Legal History from 2019 to 2020. And on a very aside note, since we are hosting, they called it Peace, I wish to mention that, I have always followed Professor Benton's excellent works on empires and violence with great importance. And I have read several works in this area of imperial and colonial violence as well from various historians and authors. But most of the works, as I have always thought that have been specific to single empires, either British, Iberian, or French, and then limited to specific time periods. I always wondered if a book could be presented where we could be provided a long history of empires and global perspectives, to imperial wars and shaping of today's international order. And I'm happy to say that they called it Peace is that book, which I always imagined. And as we see the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, with new debates on modern day empires and imperial wars, this book no doubt holds vital lessons for our present day as well, and which we will be discussing during the discussion hour 2. So with this, it is truly a great pleasure and honor to have you with us today, Professor Benton, for this most timely book roundtable, and welcome your book. And it is also equally an honor to have with us today Professor Emma Rothschild as our distinguished panelist in this session, whom I will be introducing a little later today. So, and with this, I would like to now pass on the floor to Professor Benton for her opening remarks and to move forward with the discussion. Professor, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Thank you to Suma Basu for the invitation to have this conversation, and to the Council for Global Cooperation for hosting it. Historians are supposed to feel lucky when we write books that align closely with topics that are prominently in the news. I have to say I would welcome a little less relevance for this book. There are aspects of current crises and wars going on in the present that seem to echo some of the patterns that I describe in the book. I'd be happy to talk about some of those maybe in the conversation, but to begin with, I want to emphasize that the book is historical and it focuses on legalities of so-called small wars or so-called small violence in global European empires between 1400 and 1900. And I began this project because, as you mentioned, I've been writing for some time about the history of the legal history of empires and also the history of international law. And I realized that I myself had not paid enough attention to law and violence. And when I went looking for literature and existing approaches to the history of law and war, I was mostly a bit disappointed. So there was a tendency, first of all, which is quite common in the history of warfare, to focus on major conflicts. And in the period that I work on, this would be the 7 Years' War, often described as the first global war, the Atlantic Revolutions, the Napoleonic Wars. But anyone who knows even a little about imperial history knows that there are worlds of violence outside these conflicts that are going on around them, during them sometimes, and also during periods of supposed peace. And I felt that the literature wasn't really capturing them. There's another prominent tendency, and that is to tell the history of the laws of war in ways that omit or even distort imperial violence. So some historians of international law highlight turning points in recent centuries. The late 19th century, for example, when the laws of war were codified. My colleague at Yale, John Witt, has an excellent book about Lincoln's Code, as he calls it, or the Lieber Code, which was written during the American Civil War. And then there were other attempts to codify the laws of war in the late 19th century, or the mid-20th century, when sovereign states attempted to outlaw major war and also adopted the Geneva Conventions and other measures to attempt to regulate war in an international plane. But they don't look further back than that, or not much, I should say. Now, intellectual historians do pay a lot of attention to earlier periods, but they also tend to restrict their attention to writings by European political theologians and jurists, rather than examining warfare or other violence in and on the edges of empires. So the result is either that serial small wars and the kind of grinding violence of empires get left out, or that colonial wars are portrayed as unregulated and chaotic. And behind these approaches, or really alongside them, I think you could say, there's a tendency then to tell a story of progress, a long, gradual project of applying law to contain war's destructiveness, and a representation of law as something that does that. It attempts to contain war, rather, as I think I show in the book, to, in some cases, facilitate it and structure it. So my research in this book began from a very different perspective, and it leads then to very different results. I don't start with European legal writers, although I do have something to say about them, and I'll come to that in a moment. Instead, I begin with the practices of imperial violence, and I look for patterns of war and peacemaking in and on the edges of empires. And by this route, I end up with, I think, a novel story about global war and peace. So it's a story about continuities of routines for limiting warfare that often go tragically awry. It's one of justifying violence, even extreme violence, as an action in the service of peace. It's a grim story. At times, I found it to be a slightly terrifying story, but I think it's one that is worth telling all the same. So let me give a snapshot of my findings, and then just talk a little bit more about the structure of the book. So one of them is that serial warfare was central to the formation and operation of empires. In fact, we can think of empires as unfolding in a state of perpetual war, interrupted by bouts of unstable peace. And this staccato violence that results followed clear patterns. It was not chaotic and lawless. And these patterns were global. So I characterize two global regimes of violence. One I call a regime of plunder, in which raiding and captive taking were ubiquitous across the early modern world, and a regime of what I call armed peace, which was not especially peaceful in the long 19th century, that operated on the premise that empires were, in effect, policing order. They issued standing authorization to their armies and navies to engage in limited armed interventions. And although many of these practices and the discourse surrounding them had the ambition of limiting violence, they tragically set up the conditions for atrocities to occur. Truces set up the logic and conditions for massacres. The call to use imperial violence to protect subjects set the stage for hyper-violent colonial wars. And I trace those patterns, a kind of sequencing of violence rather than extreme violence in moments of exception or emergency. Finally, I alter Eurocentric narratives about global violence. I recognize indigenous, local, non-European communities as possessing sophisticated legal capacities, and I locate the articulation of claims about Europeans' unique capacity to regulate war in conversations happening in imperial and colonial wars rather than exclusively in European diplomacy or juridical tracts. So taken together, these points sum to a view of, well, to what I call a new history of imperial violence at the threshold of war and peace. And the book is really quite concerned with, along this longue durée history, the preoccupation with, in both theory and practice, with defining limited violence or violence that is at this threshold. The book is not comprehensive, not by any measure. I use a case study approach and I analyze episodes of violence, some not labeled as war and some that are small wars, that are labeled as small wars in European empires or on their edges. So there's a chapter on raiding and truce making that analyzes how those practices were used to structure conquests and how they staged possibilities for small violence and for extreme violence. And here I offer as illustrations the logic of massacres in early Spanish and English empires in the Americas. And in what might be the quirkiest chapter of the book, and it might be my favorite, I analyze how households figured in support of complexes of raiding in early European empires. And this was just a finding that jumped out at me, not one that I expected to write about when I started. The case studies here are the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean and the English in 17th century Jamaica. So these two chapters comprise then a first section of the book that's devoted to analysis of a truly global legal regime of plunder and captive taking and looks at the legal sort of infrastructure of those activities. The second half of the book turns to the period from the mid-18th century to the end of the 19th century when European empires were globalizing militarily in a big way. Rather than focusing on their technological or geopolitical trajectories in this period, I analyze the way that these sprawling imperial military forces fit within imperial legal orders. But I begin first in the mid-18th century when Europeans who were fighting these proxy wars that were very much on the edges of empires and in regions that they did not control. They might have claimed to control, but actually did not, began to argue forcefully about standards of conduct in war. And they lobbed correspondence back and forth about conduct in war, accusations of breaking standards of conduct of war. And what I argue is that in doing so, they were articulating, before writers like Vattel got there, the claim that Europeans had the right and the authority to set and monitor the laws of war. So this is a turn that I locate in empire and not just in the European arena. I also turn then to the behavior and pronouncements of captains and commanders. They acted as legal officials, I suggest, in these empires. They carried, as I said, standing authorization to order limited interventions, and they did so regularly. So they were authorized to use violence, so-called small violence, at their discretion. Some of the time, they did engage only in limited violence. But since their very vague instructions included routinely a charge to protect imperial subjects, they also had a way of turning, often alongside settlers, into support for campaigns of extermination and dispossession. And I discussed several examples in those chapters, including the war against Aboriginal Tasmanians in the 19th century. So across these periods, we find that routines for stabilizing patterns of limited warfare also was setting the stage for horrific violence. I think it is proper to use the term atrocity for this violence because contemporaries did recognize the difference between routine violence and extreme violence. So I do use the word atrocity in the book to describe these outbreaks of extreme violence. So in closing, I just want to say a couple more things about the book. One about a methodology that is in it, and another about its perspective and I think its promise. So numerous studies in my field attempt to trace the circulation of ideas, including ideas about law and war, around the globe, from Europe to its empires, from colony to colony, back to Europe again. And in this study, I decided to go in a different direction. And I decided to just ignore the question of influence and circulation. And instead, I use a methodology that I refer to as refraction to analyze the violence outside Europe, and then to hold up those patterns in order to read canonical texts written in Europe from a fresh angle. I do think in this way we can find ways, we can highlight kind of dark corners or darkened corners of the of debates and discourses about the history of international law, and show that in fact they were more important than we thought. That is, we're not starting from contemporary doctrine and looking backwards to do a genealogy of these ideas. We may discover that themes in contemporary discourse were more important than we think. So in this way, for example, I show that Gentili and Grotius were writing extensively about truces as part of their attempt to fathom limited war and its legalities. Or to take another example, I analyze Vattel as someone writing just in a different register about a problem that was already very familiar outside Europe. And that was the challenge of constructing a regulatory order for violence in a pluripolitical region. So I think that this is a methodology that has promise. I at least found it to be fruitful, and I would welcome, a conversation about that, but just wanted to draw attention to it. I think we have a little too much discussion in our field about a stark divide between theory and practice, and I do think we need to find ways to bring those conversations together. Another point I wanted to just flag is that the book contributes to a larger agenda to fuse global history and legal history. And I suggest that in order to do so, we have to take a view of law that differs from the one that some law-trained historians may prefer. So law, in the perspective that I have adopted here, is not composed of doctrine, rules, or even norms or normativities. It's a framework for conflict, and a very loose one at that. I think that this is a perspective that allows us very clearly to arrive at a different narrative of the history of international law, one that in which, first of all, there was active participation by people other than Europeans and before the 19th century, when they began to join in discourses of international law. There is something that I like to call interpolity law operating well before that, in which there is a world of mutual intelligibility about patterns or legalities of violence, and about other elements of law, which we can discuss if there's interest. The result of all this is not a pretty picture, as I was saying. It shows, I think, the book, that the global order ticks along with endemic violence tucked inside it. It is often labeled as small violence and even ignored and tolerated right up into the point that it breaks into periods of great atrocity. And unfortunately, I think this pattern in many respects is still with us. I'm sorry to say that the book ends not with a recipe for fixing this condition. I don't have a recipe for fixing this condition, but it ends with a warning. And the warning is to distrust anyone in any age who promises to keep small wars small. That is a promise that they cannot keep. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this, providing this wonderful overview of your book. And it's indeed some important themes that we came up with. And we would definitely carry it on in the discussion. It's a lot to carry on in the discussion. So, and we will definitely do it. So with this, let us now go to our distinguished panelist in our today's session for her commentary. In the panel today, we have with us is Professor Emma Rothschild. Professor Emma Rothschild is the Jeremy and Jane Knowles Professor of History at Harvard University. She is also the director of the Joint Center for History and Economics at Magdalen College of the University of Cambridge. Professor Rothschild is a scholar of economic history and has worked in the domains of imperial history as well as economic history of 18th century and 19th century. Some of her important monographs include Paradise Lost, The Decline of Auto-Industrial Age, Economic Sentiments, Adam Smith, Condorcet, and the Enlightenment, The Inner Life of Empires and 18th Century History, and Infinite History, The Story of a Family in France over 3 centuries. She has been an honorary member to various universities and research institutions and has served as a board member to the United Nations Foundation. It is truly a pleasure to have you with us today, Professor Rothschild. The floor is yours. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you particularly for giving me the opportunity to read very carefully Professor Benton's absolutely wonderful book. I mean, it's a congratulations. It's a remarkable achievement. I think it questions so many assumptions about the ways in which we do history, but also about the ways in which we think about our own past and memory. I mean, the sort of challenge to the implicit hierarchy in so much historical writing, that there's some kind of high history which corresponds to intellectual history, which corresponds to international law, really is not intact after one's after one's read this book. And it's I just to sort of connecting this to my own work. I mean, I loved your phrase about adroit quasi-lawyers, because the sort of archives I worked in were full of these characters who of all national origins, and male and female, some of them desperately looking for a single copy of a law book because there wasn't any in that particular colony, and so on. So I think the book challenges a lot of assumptions about history. It challenges a lot of very deep assumptions about the chronology of the past, quarter of a millennium, maybe half of a millennium. And I was thinking about the late, great Bernard Baylin's late book, The Barbarous Years. And there's a sort of assumption in North American history that the 17th century was sort of super barbarous at the edges of empire. And then civilization appeared over the course of the 18th century. Perhaps it had to do with reading books, perhaps it had to do with Enlightenment ideas, perhaps it had to do with urbanization, but then there was a gentle, if occasionally interrupted, progress towards civilization. And I think one cannot look at that that very well accepted story in the same way after reading this book. And then the other thing I do want to say, and this was touched on, the book, when I came to your afterword and understood that this was in some way a COVID project of research, that made so much sense to me, because it is a bleak book to read, and I loved that you sort of were interrupted by family life in the way that we all were during COVID. But I think it also corresponds to a sense of bleakness about the world in which we live that many people did feel during COVID, and that is only intensified now. And it's just, I mean, obviously the book had gone to the printer long before the current, and I choose my words with care, the current violence in Gaza had begun in its present form, but it's sort of terrifyingly evocative of the new and also small wars around which we live. So it's a fantastic book. I want to raise, I had so many things I wanted to raise, but I want to raise sort of two substantive points where I'd love to hear more from Professor Benton, and then actually four minor points where I don't, unless you have anything particular to say. I see these in the category of future work by your students and others, sort of building on this remarkable book. So the first of the sort of larger points has to do with the continuum between the individual, the household, the group, and the state, particularly in relation to violence. I mean, I was so pleased that you said your favorite chapter was the one about Albuquerque and the Caribbean. I was blown away by that chapter, but it does seem to me that maybe you are saying something really profound about how we conceptualize the individual as well as the household in relation to to violence and war. individuals are perpetrators of violence in what is, now thought of as an ordinary criminal situation, as a domestic or familial or household situation, as members of groups, and then as sort of authorized members of legally constituted entities. And I would love to hear you talk more about that. The second sort of substantive point is really, and this reflects my interest in economic history. If you could say more about how commerce fits into this story. I mean, I was very struck when you talked about vassalage by, again, in my own work, the East India Company officials in the 1750s swearing, eternal fealty as vassals of lower potentates of the declining Mughal Empire, and their oaths, their extraordinarily elaborate oaths were translated from Persian into Bengali into English, and kept for posterity. And I think it's we can, I think, put to one side the benevolent Albert Hirschman idyll in which commerce brought peace and civility and good ways of behaving over the course of the period, the period you're mostly talking about, from over the 17th and 18th century here. But I do think the extent to which not only plunder, but also what would in modern terms be called kind of investment opportunities were central to this. And I think this is another way in which your book is extremely challenging to deep assumptions that historians have, one of which is that there's a distinction between the market and the state, or the economy and the state. And it's a familiar problem in the history of economic thought that conceptualization of the state leaves out war and violence. But I think conceptualization of the market leaves it out to an alarming extent. And there's a wonderful quote from the late lamented James Crawford, who was a judge on the International Court of Justice. He had a marvelous essay about what he called, quote, this international law of particularities. And he wrote, in some sense, international law has always been shattered. From the beginning, it has been composed of different pieces that refract differentially. And then this is really, it was an essay about international law as a practice. Quote, it is a day-to-day discipline with day-to-day effects. Noble functionaries or not, we spend our professional lives for the most part in particulars, whether on dealing with land or maritime boundaries, or the movement of persons, goods, or credit across those boundaries. And I think his description of the practice of 20th century international law did correspond to the practice of quasi-lawyers in the long sweep of centuries that you're talking about. And perhaps, I mean, again, just in my own work, I think this came out quite strikingly in relation to the law and violence where it affected enslaved people, because the deep questions, or what questions that are deep to us, came up quite frequently in relation to things like mortgages on enslaved people and inheritance of enslaved people. So I would love to hear what you what you sort of think about that too. Then let me just sort of rattle off my list of places where I would love your students or others to follow up on this work. Islamic law, how did Islamic legal ideas about war and violence intersect with or not intersect with these conflicts? Then you talked about the use of the word atrocities. Somebody should do a reception history using all these digitized newspapers about how, for example, the British or French press over the longue durée actually used this sort of this hypocritical language to describe violence, small violence perpetrated by their co-citizens. I mean, it would be an amazing project. Then I think the sort of construction of quasi-professional armed forces over this period is really interesting in relation to this. I mean, it was an enormous effort in mid-18th century France, who more for the continental armies than for the remote armies. But people that there were mercenaries, there were people who came in and out of the armed forces. There were women who followed the armed forces who may or may not have had certain kinds of protections. And I think that's another body of law which would be just fascinating to follow, inspired by this. And then finally, no, it's not even finally. I've got two more. You cite Karin Kupperman's work, and I wondered about weather and climate, whether there was an assumption that it was something about the intemperate climate that made these wars likely and or even understandable. And I just don't know, but since we're all material historians now, I did think about that. And the final point is just to go back to the contemporary resonance. After I'd read this, your book, I looked back at a book by Mary Kaldor, which is a sort of classic in political theory and international relations, called Old and New Wars, mostly about it. I mean, it's now in its third edition, but it was written mostly about Bosnia and then about Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think in some ways it's a work of kind of political theory that you don't like, which is making generalizations about an old kind of war and then a new kind of war. But I think it does go to some of the questions about a sort of permanent state of violence where individuals go in and out of what we would think of as individual crime, and then violence within the household, and then membership in groups, and then access to new kinds of weapons, and then sort of retreat into intervals of peace. So I think there is something not only about, Ukraine and Gaza, which is so spectacular now, but also about the sort of very end of the 20th century and early 21st century wars in southeastern Europe. So that's a shopping list of more work to be done following your inspiration, but it's a reflection of how much I enjoyed. I mean, I did enjoy, as well as being awed by this book. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Those were generous and really interesting comments. And I absolutely hope that this, will inspire some other people to work in a similar vein or on similar topics. It was just impossible to cover everything. It is more suggestive about central themes and different and rubrics for organizing violence than it is intended to be in any way comprehensive. So I hope that it stimulates a lot of other work. Should I respond a little bit as a way of just keeping the conversation going?
You can respond and then we can discuss. Yes, yeah.
Great. So I was really glad that you brought up also this business about individuals and households, because as I started to say before, I didn't think, oh, let me write something about households in war or what's going on in early empires. I was actually just reading into descriptions of raiding in the Indian Ocean. I wanted to understand what the Portuguese were up to, and came and read through these letters of Afonso de Albuquerque to the king in the early 16th century, in which he cannot stop talking about households and marriage. And at one point says to the king, "This is my most vexing problem." And I thought, well, let me sit and think with that for a while. What is it about households that is so important to this early imperial project? And how is it related to the Portuguese continual investment in war making? And I began to think about this problem, or really question about how households were connected to war. But this brings up the larger subject that you were alluding to, which is how the imagination of political participation, political belonging, political community were undergirding these complexes of raiding and in later periods, other patterns of violence. So what I find to be useful here is to think about households as legal entities, right? We've got lots and lots of literature on households as social entities, as arenas for conflict about gender, race, servitude, enslavement. But to think about households as legal entities in which there's a household head with authority over a whole range of subordinates of different status, and then to think about that formation in the context of these quite violent regional arenas, to me, just sort of popped up these interesting connections, the way that households were holding captives, the way they were holding investments. This goes to your capital, I should say. This goes to your second comment about commerce, the way that these intimate spaces, defined by contemporaries also as intimate spaces, were connected to arguments about the legitimacy of warfare, the justification for warfare, the language of protection in order to protect households, that one could go to war locally without any reference to metropolitan officials. and so forth. I don't want to summarize the book here, but just this chapter, but just to say that I think the legal lens, by thinking about authority and belonging as kind of central elements of legal order in this period, you can illuminate relationships that are inaccessible if you enter in this sort of genealogical approach from the future, looking back at the past. And just to say one more thing about that, I think that I found that although historians have not picked up on this connection between household relations and war, contemporaries were not at all confused about it. They saw this as a very central relationship, something that was key to their ability to justify violence and local warfare, key to their ability to maintain captive taking and to build, in fact, much bigger systems of slaving and enslavement. So that I did find to be useful. But I just wanted to say in response to your interesting comments that to me, for me, what opened this up was to sort of think with and through the way that historical actors were engaging with a legal discourse about authority and belonging. That is the key point, I think. I think that, if I were to write the whole thing over starting today, I would probably do more to pull out the threads having to do with commerce, because I think it is there in the book and is very, very interesting. So a number of things which I'm sure you noticed in reading are quite central, having to do with commerce. One, as you said, that there is commerce continuing in these sort of complexes of raiding and truce making and violent truce breaking that are going on. So it's not as if commerce is just something that happens in moments of peace and then war breaks out and it stops, right? There is the staccato warfare that's going on is also happening alongside these commercial relations and trade relations. So in addition, the main ways that this comes out, the relations to commerce in the text, has to do, first of all, with plunder, as you described, and the high motivations that participants in warfare had to engage in warfare, because it was a way to get stuff, right? They are seizing not just stuff, but there's a big emphasis in the book on the seizing of captives as a very valuable endeavor in these raiding complexes. The other thing that comes out clearly in these raiding complexes is the importance of tribute. And this goes to your point about vassalage. In the first chapter, which is about these raiding and truce breaking and ultimatums to surrender that were so typical across the early modern world, if I had an aha moment when I was writing it, it was in reading a slim volume by a relatively obscure Spanish historian about the series of truces that occurred in the what historians used to call the Reconquista, or the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. And there were, in the 150 years leading up to the conquest of Granada, 74 truces. And what was so interesting to me when I began to look at these truces, which I could do because they've been collected in this compendium, was that they were not just equal peace pacts, they were actually unequal treaties that in effect, not in effect, they actually designated how much tribute was going to be paid and recognized in them the rulers of Granada, who were the Sienese, were saying that they were vassals of the Catholic monarchs. I did not expect that language to be there. and they were paying tribute. So this was, these truces were about these tribute payments that were flowing. They were a crucial part of it. And when truces broke down, which they did with great regularity and were then renegotiated, it was often the tribute amount that was renegotiated. So this was a kind of key part, this tribute paying to conquest and imperial expansion across the globe. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention about commerce, because it is so interesting to me, is that in the long 19th century, in the late 19th century in particular, well, I should say the middle decades, when there is this kind of system of authorized limited violence going on the edges of the British Empire, you can also trace this kind of very convenient slippage from a language of protecting British subjects. I know it best in the British literature, but it does happen in other empires. Protecting imperial subjects, and then that language slides into protecting imperial interests. So there is a way of just inserting the protection for merchants, for traders, for investments, for property that comes through this language of protecting imperial subjects. And it happens almost imperceptibly, but it is an important turn. And from that language, then there is also a further opening to the notion of protecting order. And so this is a very, very slippery language that in effect leads from, this is back to your point about the connections between the individual and the political community. It leads directly from the imperative to protect individuals to the imperative to protect some much more vast imagination of commercial investment, production, and order. So that you can authorize a lot if you are protecting order. Charlie, I see your hand up. So would you like to come in?
Yeah, Professor Mayer, you can ask some questions. Yeah.
You're on mute, I think.
Yeah.
Did you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we can.
I feel privileged as seen to be the audience for this great dialogue between Emma and Lauren. And this book will be on my summer reading list, along with yesterday we presented new books in the history department. And Tamar Herzog has some new surveys on law, which you and she will be my primary reading list. I wanted to, just listening to it, and excuse me, this is, off the wall because I haven't read the book, but it does remind me, I wrote a little book on empire when in America, when we were venturing into Iraq, which was something I deeply opposed and which pushed me into that. And certain things, what you say are, just ring so true, and others, but other points I'd just like to emphasize as a listener. First of all, the fact that their empire, the politics of empire, starts on the edges. That look at Caesar and the Rubicon. It just, that somehow, look at our political, whether Korea or Vietnam or anything, there's just a sort of quicksand of empire once you engage in it. And it goes along, I think, with perhaps your lesson that, don't think you can do this in a little way without getting deeply into the quicksand. The other, of course, is I think what John Keegan's book on World War I emphasized too. It's not an effort to demarcate, but the fact that there are killing zones and non-killing zones, and in the killing zones, anything goes. Really, the laws you have attempted to set up, perhaps for your own wars, don't work, or you just can be ignored. And when There's a lot. If you look back in the center, siege warfare has many of these rules that that became applicable as long as if the demand to surrender was ignored, anything went with a besieged city. There's a lovely book on Shakespeare and war. I don't know if you've encountered it yet, about which looks at the medieval and early modern rules of war. And about plunder too. I think you have to think about it as a way of paying soldiers. These soldiers, are recruited. You can't always pay them. This was certainly true in the lowlands in the 17th century. Plunder was your way of paying off the people who are fighting for you, which I think is important. And tribute. I don't know if you tribute and vassalage. That's always been. It's been seen into as the Chinese, of course, built their world system, international system, on tributary relations with the periphery and people around them. And they were always complaining about the quality of the tribute. We get these bad horses from this place or that place. So in some ways, I'm just fascinated by the separation and the interaction, the need to, and in fact, the codependence of these areas of war and peace. And maybe you've stressed this. I would also commerce. I don't know whether I assume you do, but I mean, letters of marque have always puzzled me. You get a legal right to piracy essentially from your sovereign, which I guess is supposed to protect you and justify you. But it speaks to Emma's point that it's not easy to extricate commerce from warfare. I mean, one thing you get Voltaire is great on this stuff. I mean, whether he's talking about violence in Candide, or whether he's talking about the English letters, where he says, when people enter the marketplace in London and no one cares whether they're Quakers, Jews, Christians, or whatever, it's they're in a world where there are rules of exchange and abstraction. And I think the letters of marque, the way they're exceptions. I'd like to ask you, because I've read some horrifying accounts of, we keep on having them, of wars on the periphery, but take Carl Schmitt. What do you think of his argument that essentially international law was a way that contending empires decided to regulate their frontiers, or they're rubbing up against each other? And whether to try and minimize the violence that would encounter the homelands. It's a little bit like what we're watching in the newspaper this morning. This craziness between Israel and Iran. I mean, Israel's now weighing its reprisals against yesterday's or day before yesterday's attacks, and somehow the discussion about Israel's bombing of the embassy, the Iranian consulate in Damascus doesn't seem to come up. These chains of violence. So people decide when the other side began them. Anyone who's raised kids knows that when kids are screaming at each other, they each say the other one did it, and you finally have to say, go to your rooms. There's no way of sorting this out. So I don't know, the legal structure as an inter-imperial convenience. I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Great. So thanks.
It sounds absolutely fascinating, though. I look forward to getting rid of all the semester stuff and getting to it.
Well, thanks. It'll be great to think about you reading the book this summer. So, you know, the points that you raise about the way siege warfare worked, and the kind of license that to engage in extreme violence when the other side did not capitulate. This is really central to the way that these kind of cycles of violence worked across the early modern world. And one of the things that I will say about the attempt early in the book is, but it is a consistent theme throughout, is to try to show that these European patterns of warfare were actually patterns of warfare that were intelligible and existing across the early modern world. So when Europeans did have this, follow these patterns of siege warfare that you described, the truce-making pattern that I just described, the truce, extreme violence when truce breaking occurred, I try to generalize this pattern and to show that it is indeed a global pattern. And so that when Europeans, as empires were expanding, arrive in the Indian Ocean and on the other side of the Atlantic, they are not operating against foes who do not understand their methods of warfare. This is an interpolitical or interpolity law that one can find across the board. One thing to say about the truces that I was just describing that is really important is that if you look at this pattern in this sort of very broad way, it kind of takes you away from thinking about the kind of the exclusively European way of describing siege warfare, for example, and to look at truces as often implicit, sometimes, as I was pointing out, serial, and then truce breaking becomes a moment that is very much analogous to the extreme violence that occurred in siege warfare when the other side was not capitulating. So the truce breaking is a moment, and as I point out in the book, hardly anybody ever says, we're breaking the truce now. They just start war up again, and they start it up with extra energy, a sort of emotional charge that comes along with their perception that there's been a betrayal of some often just implicit or assumed agreement to keep the peace in a certain sort of way. So that is one theme that sort of trying to take from the sort of small understandings we have, the regional understandings of how truces or sieges work, and just kind of blowing it out to think about this as a global pattern that actually, because of its ubiquitousness, in fact, facilitates the movement of imperial interests and forces around the world. I have a lot to say that is about Schmidt. I think Schmidt is wrong about almost everything and right about just a small number of things. And in the book, I try to emphasize, although most of the critique of Schmidt falls below the line, my uneasiness and unhappiness with the Schmittian approach to this. I'll just describe a couple of ways in which I think that Schmidt's approach and others similar to his are distorting. One is that in Nomos of the Earth, he just perpetuates this idea that law is something that happens in Europe, in a European sphere, and everything outside is some other kind of violence that is not encompassed in European public law. And I think this is part of the kind of general distortion that I was describing, this general tendency to represent, what's happening out there is lawless. We don't have to concern ourselves with it. What we're focused on is the European legal order. The other thing, the way that Schmidt's influence is kind of insidiously unhelpful is is the focus on extreme violence in moments of emergency. And you can see this a little bit. You can see her grappling with it, but you can see it in Carolyn Elkins's book about the 20th century British imperial violence, in which she kind of uses a Schmittian approach and therefore focuses on extreme violence in the empire in emergency. And what I'm trying to do here is say, you don't even need emergency, right? And nobody needed emergency to justify extreme violence or to move from routine to extreme violence, because there's a kind of sequence, just in the same way that you just described, the sort of logical sequence that leads from the demand for capitulation to extreme violence in siege warfare. There are these sequences that lead very logically from kind of potentially limited violence, but have always tucked inside them the possibility of openings to extreme violence. So I prefer that as a sort of general emphasis, even though I do use the word term protection emergencies in the book to think about the way that these calls for protection of imperial subjects often dragged empires or brought imperial forces into violent engagements. There are other ways that I think Schmidt is unhelpful, but I'll just talk about one more way. And that is that, Schmidt knew next to nothing about violence outside Europe or anything outside Europe, in fact. One might say he knew not that much about Europe, but that's another subject. I think that this is reflected in his tendency, which is also represented in a much larger literature, which is not Schmittian, to represent these small wars happening in empires as examples of, for Schmidt, partisan warfare, for other people, asymmetric warfare. So the description of small wars as asymmetric wars is something which has now kind of entered the mainstream. And it is, I think, not helpful. So when I look at these, when you look at these things historically, it turns out not so asymmetric, right? A lot of the small violence being perpetrated by imperial agents, imperial forces, armies and navies, is small, disorganized, not authorized from the top. It is something, hey, it looks a little bit like guerrilla warfare, although we would never call it that, right? So I think that we miss something if we're taking this kind of Schmittian view of partisan warfare or the broader view of asymmetric warfare, and then sort of look back at these imperial encounters. Lots more to say about Schmidt, but I will leave it there.
Okay, one question.
Yeah.
Race, that term hasn't really come up. How does it play into your
Well,
scheme?
it plays quite centrally in that turn of discourse towards the self-authorization by Europeans to regulate the laws of war and to set the standards of conduct in war. So it's in those mid-18th century wars on the edges of empires where Europeans start to engage one another very intensively about conduct in warfare. So you have, for example, I treat the Second Carnatic War, as it's called, in South Asia, on the Coromandel coast, extensively, where you have company officials of the French and the English lobbing accusations back and forth about the conduct of war by both other imperial forces and by their allies. And so this was again something I didn't expect to find. I just went to sort of read and see how people were describing this conflict, and I found this thick correspondence, literally thousands of letters going back and forth about conduct in war. Now, part of that intensification of a European focused a European focus on the laws of war involves a now very new, very sharp discourse about, it's not entirely new, but it's certainly sharpened, about the savagery of other groups. And here you have racial discourse coming in, and indeed it pervades this vision of a long 19th century armed peace, right? It is an armed peace by that very much follows the color line, the kind of global color line that has been talked about by other scholars. So I do see it as consistent with the kind of, I like Duncan Bell's recent book about the Anglo-American dream world of race, as he calls it. And I discussed that a little bit in the book as being very consistent with this move, although I am not principally focused on the language of race.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And I just wanted to, say, I read your book and I had a few, questions which I would be very glad if you could answer, like, which you also, it came up in our conversation as well. Like, we have seen several scholarships and, philosophical studies where, scholars and even historians have, equated empires with ideologies. Like, we have seen, like, comparison with, suppose, liberalism, social Darwinism, even idealism. So according to me, honestly, I feel that empires are primarily driven by, the motivation of domination and exploitation. I do not see any benevolence in terms of empires, because I feel empires are malevolent entity. But like, how do you see these, equations? Like, do you think like empires, whether historical or in present times, can have any ideologies at all? Yes, I wanted to ask your, views as a historian. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the question. That is a great question, and it is one that I can see could pop up in relation to this book quite prominently. I think that one of the things that I'm not, as you will have noticed in the book, really focused so much on ideologies, but more on practices, and then the sort of, discourses that are packed around those practices. And one of the things that I think does come out of the book, which not everybody is going to like, but to me it is there, is that there were these projects that kind of cut across imperial history that various actors in empires not just embraced, but tried to generalize about how to limit violence, right? And I think it's important that we recognize that there is a project of limiting violence that is quite central in canonical European texts and in imperial practice. Now, as I said, not everybody's going to like that message, because they're, I can, as I say, sort of somewhere in the opening to the book, I get it, right? People want to represent European empires as just, purely malevolent. And I'm not really approaching this question as a corrective on that. But I simply think it's important to recognize that people in power, not just in empires, right, very often are themselves attempting to limit violence, right? Violence isn't always great for commerce. Violence isn't always great for maintaining political power and stability. And so I think we have to keep our eyes on that. If we don't, we're distorting the historical record, but also we may be hampering our ability to understand the dynamics of what's going on. So if we start, you and I were chatting about this in the before the session began. If we start with some sort of caricature of malevolent empire, or of settler colonialism, which is just bent on extermination, we'll miss the dynamics that they do lead on occasion, more than on occasion, to these campaigns of extermination. But I think we should try to understand the relationship between these projects of limiting violence, which are there, and the outbreak of extreme violence, rather than assume that extreme violence is just going to be the natural result of imperial or indeed empire state geopolitical engagement.
Yeah, exactly. And in this point, I wanted to mention there are also these conflicts between studies, like the point you mentioned, the violence, like suppose in terms of international law, since you are a legal historian as well, like you would know that international law doesn't have any definitions for violence such as like atrocities or like massacres. And this is the problem with the definitions of the violence, and the international law does occur, like the Geneva Convention, or even the Genocide Convention doesn't strictly classify the forms of violence. And this is also a problem. Like, how do you see this the conflict of this classification of violence as a legal historian or as an intellectual historian, and in these perspectives? Yeah.
Well, as I try to trace in the book, over this long period, you have various attempts to talk about limited war and to describe it. And one of these, which I discuss late in the book, is the 19th century project of describing measures short of war, right? That comes into play in the late 19th century as a kind of central way of approaching this question. And then, I won't rehearse it here, but there's a discussion of some of the difficulties of that, but also some of the motivations behind it, which are to try to describe relationships between, and very relevant to the current context, between sort of hegemonic powers and smaller polities that are sort of on the edges. They're both considered semi-inside and semi-outside empires or even imperial spheres of influence. So these measures short of war were devised, this kind of language, in part as a way of talking about this sort of relationship between this kind of policing mode that imperial forces got into. And one of the things I do bring up in the book is the way that in Ukraine, Russia was using an imperial language very much when it was describing the invasion as a special military operation. This is very 19th century,
yeah, exactly.
Very much 19th century kind of imperial language to describe war as policing. And that also is connected to these measures short of war. So I do deal with that, but historically more than in contemporary settings.
Yeah, exactly. And since we are almost at the end of our lovely discussion, maybe we since, as I was mentioning to you earlier as well, when your book came up, like this is they called it peace is more relevant now, since we are seeing the wars in Ukraine, Gaza, and even the Nagorno-Karabakh ethnic cleansing, which we saw. We have done events on Ukraine and Gaza in our CGC as well. So, and I think the imperial violence and colonial violence has become much more relevant in our contemporary times, even though these terms sounds like historical. So, like I wanted to ask this question, and I would be very happy if Professor Rothschild can also answer, as a ending remarks. Like, my last question is like, with the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, like when we see new forms of imperial wars and new forms of imperial and colonial violence taking up, like the role of international organizations like are struggling to define the acts of a genocide or genocidal war crimes. So we have seen their failure to act upon them. So as we encounter new forms of violence and wars, so how as a legal historian or a scholar of international law, I mean, would you like to provide learnings or recommendations, for the international legal communities, in order to, like how a new charter, for, prevention of violence and acts in terms of current wars should be, a question. Yeah, I wanted to ask you. Yeah.
Perhaps I should come in briefly so that
Yeah, sure.
Professor has the last word on our event. Just two things. We've talked a lot in the discussion, the public discussion about Ukraine, about ammunition, and I think this is another point where the economic aspect of wars is really important. I mean, people make a lot of profits in wartime, and there's also a complicated politics of preventing access to means of violence. I mean, I think one of the many virtues of Lauren Benton's book is that it isn't a technologically deterministic book in the way that some of the current literature on new wars is, but it's there were huge profits being made on saltpeter in India in the period of the 18th century East India Company. There were huge profits being made between Spanish and French Hispaniola on means of warfare. And I do think in relation to what can be done, that that can be an important way of reducing levels of violence, to have some interdiction of means of violence. And I want to be optimistic about this fragmented international law. I think that conventions on genocide, conventions on humanitarian law in wartime have reduced levels of, have reduced violence and have saved human lives, children's lives in wartime. So I think we have to have hope about what can be done in the International Court of Justice, what can be done in other international law fora. There isn't an option, as people 15 years ago aspired to, of having a new United Nations on the basis of a new enlightened world order. These are the instruments that we have, and that is the slender reed of hope in relation to the challenge in the last words of Professor Benton's wonderful book.
Thank you, and I'll try to end. It's hard for me to end on a note of similar hope, but I will say that I agree with the very heartily with the notion that we don't have a choice but to work with the tools that we have for limiting war. The thing that I think that the historical lens can provide here is through the power of analogy, some ability to analyze some of the dangers of the modalities for limiting warfare, and that is something that I think can come out of the reading. I hope could come out of the reading of this book. So, for example, in the current situation in Gaza, the call for ceasefire is understandable. I personally strongly endorse it. The international community is calling, rightfully, I think, for a ceasefire. I think that the history that we have just been discussing today suggests that this is a tool, but it also is one that is laden with dangers. And those dangers are the continuation of warfare, that this will be a pause or a rest from war rather than an end, and that it might be followed by a return to violence that is justified and that is also extreme following it. So that is a cautionary tale. I think that it's not a bad cautionary tale to both recognize that we again and again are going to be driven towards the use of a handful of modalities for limiting violence, either legally or geopolitically, because we don't have other tools. And to recognize this also as a long-standing problem that has set up the dynamics very often for return to extreme violence. And so I think keeping both those things together in the same analytical frame, I hope could be somewhat helpful into the future. Thank you.
I'll endorse those views, and thank the two of you for this great discussion. I only and I look forward to reading the book. It's been Suvama, it's a very privileged conversation, obviously, but thank you for hosting it.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, they called it Pieces. As I mentioned, it's a very relevant book. And I'm sure, like, after this discussion, our audiences would love reading it, as well as, it's very much learning and important, for upcoming days. Yeah, indeed.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you, Sumama, for the opportunity to have the conversation, and Charlie Mayer, and especially Emma Rothschild for reading it. Professor Rothschild has been one of my favorite interlocutors over the years about imperial history. So it's really a privilege for me to have the opportunity to talk about my book and with her and with the rest of you. So thanks so much.
Yeah, indeed. And we hope, wish you best with your other projects as well as this, with this book as well. And it was indeed an honor and privilege to, host this book. And thank you so much, Professor Benton, Professor Rothschild, and even Professor Mayer for joining us today and providing your thoughtful, insights on this study. Yeah, so thank you all for joining us. Yeah.
Thank you.